Hi, and welcome. You're listening to the X22 Report. My name is Dave, and this is episode 1595A, and today's date is June 19th, 2018, and the title of the episode is, The Next Recession is Going to be Horrific. Let's get into the economic collapse financial news. Now, we've talked about housing quite a bit, and we know as the interest rates move up, it kicks a lot of individuals out of the housing market, and this is why we're seeing mortgage applications decline. This is why we're seeing refinance applications decline. This is why we're seeing sales decline, and this is going to continue on. And once everything's all said and done, we're going to look back and we're going to say, wow, look what happened here. It's the same thing that happened in prior to 2008, where the Fed raised the rates and the whole system just fell apart and it hit the real estate market, because we are definitely seeing this in the real estate market. We're seeing permits, they have plunged. We're starting to see housing sales decline. And we need to remember something very important. And we say this in the last, 2-3 years, that during the summer season, the housing market is supposed to be the hottest, no pun intended there. And this is when people come out and they're out of school. They want to move to a different home with their family. They want to be in there before school starts again. It's warm, so the move is a lot easier. And people go out and they look for homes. This is not happening. And what we're seeing right now is that permits, they are plunging. Now, housing starts, they moved up a little bit, but what they did was they went back in time and they revised the numbers to make the housing starts look a lot better. And they play with the numbers quite often. But when we look at this overall on a year-to-year basis, we're starting to see a decline in all of this. Actually, U.S. home builder stocks, they are declining. U.S. Housing Data Surprise Index, that is declining, and we're starting to see this hit everywhere. Now, what's very interesting is that maybe 2 or 3 reports back, we talked about the global yield, the curve, how it was inverted. Well, we're seeing the same thing with the corporate yield curve. It has just inverted, and we're starting to see this in all different areas right now. And when we look once again at a graph, when the corporate yield curve inverts, we enter a recession. And here we are once again, we're at that same exact time period. And basically, we're going to be running into a huge amount of trouble here. Now, every trough in the curve has always corresponded to some market crisis, whether the Asian crisis, the tech bubble, the great financial crisis, or the liquidity squeeze we are experiencing now. So every time we see this, we see something happen. Now we're starting to see all these indicators point to the same exact thing. And Paul Tudor Jones warns that the next recession is going to be really frightening. And this is coming from global macro trader Paul Tudor Jones, is warning that the asset prices are too high. He's concerned about what the next recession might look like. The market right now is jacked up and ready to go. And he added that it's like pouring lighter fluid on an already lit fire. We don't have any stabilizers. During the financial crisis, central banks had a lot of room to ease monetary policy, and governments had more flexibility to push stimulative fiscal policy. Today, there's less room and flexibility. The next recession is really frightening because we don't have any stabilizers. We'll have monetary policy, which will exhaust really quickly, but we don't have any fiscal stabilizers. He said, the one thing I've learned over the last 40 years, these price patterns, it's the same old story, so often just with different characters, different times, different plots, and we're going to be entering the same thing that we've seen in the past. And what we've seen in the past is the entire system implode. Everything that we've been looking at, everything that we've been discussing, all the indicators that we've been watching, we are doing the same exact thing that we did prior to 2008. Yes, they might have shuffled things around to make it look a lot better, but they created the same exact bubbles. They are doing the same exact thing as they did back in 2008, where they're raising the interest rates, and then they had to lower the interest rates because they started an economic collapse scenario, which turned into the great financial crisis of 2008, and they were allowed to start QE during that period. But everything that we've been watching, the inverted yield curve, too much debt, everything is pretty much the same. I mean, it's rhyming really, really well with what happened back in 2008. And this all means that this system is not going to last. I mean, think about how many indicators we have covered so far that have been showing us that we are headed towards a recession, depression, collapse. Now, I think we've been in a recession for quite a while, and I think what the government has done and central banks have done is they've manipulated the data so much that nobody can even tell anymore if we're in a recession until everything starts to really collapse. And I think that's what they've done to this point. They've manipulated everything so much. The stock market, GDP numbers, unemployment numbers. Corporations have been buying back their own stock, faking their earnings and their profits. The loans that have been taken out with the shadow banking system has been pushed off from the big banks onto the little banks, and they've been shuffling all this stuff around. And as the Fed is raising rates and as they're tightening, we're starting to see cracks in the system. And as we move forward, we're going to see a lot more cracks appear. Now, Russia and India, they've made a military deal, and they decided that they were going to bypass U.S. sanctions by using the rupee and the ruble in bilateral trade involving their military equipment deal. Some $2 billion in weapons deals between India and Russia have been hit as a result of the recent U.S. sanctions. So the countries said, you know something, why don't we just bypass this? Why do we need to use the dollar? We don't. We'll just use another form of currency. And that's what they did. This is how countries get around all these ridiculous sanctions. The sanctions really don't do anything right now. Now, yesterday we mentioned that Russia was dumping, U.S. treasuries. And we also noticed that China and many other countries have been dumping U.S. treasuries. But what's very interesting is that Russia came out and they gave us the reason why they're dumping U.S. treasuries. They're saying they're dumping them because they want to keep their reserves safe. And the Central Bank of Russia went on to say, and this used to be a private Western central bank, which was controlled by the Rothschilds, but Putin stepped in and took control of the private Western central bank. And this is why Russia is the enemy right now. This is normally what happens. This is why the corporate media, all those individuals in the deep state, continually push the idea that Russia is the enemy, because they moved away from the Rothschild private Western central bank system, and any country that does this, they are now the enemy. And what we're seeing right now is many countries out there, they're realizing and they're understanding that they need to repatriate their gold. They need to move away from the dollar. They need to have bilateral trade with other countries outside of the dollar. And they're all doing this to protect themselves. So this next collapse of this system, it's going to be very difficult for many people. And we've been talking about getting gold, getting supplies, making sure you have water, getting toiletry, medical supplies, food, and all that. Because when the system starts to break down, and believe me, the corporate media is not going to be on the news saying, hey, by the way, the system's breaking down, you better run to the market, get your supplies, you better run over here, get your money out of the bank, you better buy some gold. They're not going to tell you any of this. Actually, they're going to mention this at the last possible second when everything is falling apart. That's when they'll say, oh, look, the stock market came down. As we've been seeing, it's been bobbing up and down and hasn't been really making any new highs lately, which is another sign. And they're just going to basically, at the last second, tell you that things are not going well. And at that time, it's going to be too late. You will not be able to purchase gold. You will not be able to, most likely, to purchase any cryptocurrencies. You will not be able to get food, because what happens in these situations, like we saw back in 2008, we had a credit crisis. Credit was freezing up. Banking systems were freezing up. This is why the central bank, the Fed, had to create currency like crazy and feed it into the system. They've already done this. They already have $4.5 trillion on the books. They're trying to get rid of it. They're raising the interest rates right now like they did prior to 2008. We're seeing all the same signs that we've seen before. This tells us that we're going to be going into a credit crisis once again. And once again, it's depending on who has the narrative, they're the ones who are going to steer this collapse. This is not about avoiding the collapse or putting the collapse on hold. This is about steering the entire population through this next recession, through this next collapse of the system. And this is going to be a collapse of the central banking system. And we need to remember the central banking system, they would like to have the narrative because they want to start this whole system over again. They thought they were going to have a better story because they thought they were going to use an event like war or something like that to explain away why their system failed, but they won't tell you it failed, but that's the whole reason it failed and why they needed to restart it someplace else. That they were going to make up a whole story and how everyone needed to, buckle in, everyone needed to sacrifice. That's why supplies aren't coming into the stores. This is why you can't get fuel. If you go back to 1971, they owned the narrative back then, and they made up all these different stories to tell you why we were coming off the gold standard onto the petrodollar system. But they really didn't tell you that. They just told you that they were taking us off the gold standard because of speculators, and we were having fuel shortages. People couldn't find jobs. We saw a huge inflation. Interest rates were very high, but they never really explained what was really going on. And the same thing's going to happen this time. But it depends on who has the narrative. If the central banks have the narrative, that means the Trump administration lost. That means the central bank has the control, the deep state has control, and they're going to make up a story to tell you why all of this is happening. Most likely blame this on Trump and Russia and whatever else they're going to make up. If Trump has the narrative, basically they're going to tell you that we're coming off a central banking system. We're moving on to a people system. They might not use those words, but all of this is going to be done to help the population. And depending on what they say and how they shape the narrative, people are going to understand that this system was built up on a phony central bank model. And basically, to push this narrative forward, the blame will have to be on the central banking system, where there might need to be an audit to see what they were actually doing. And of course, they're going to find a lot of stuff. And once that stuff comes out, they will be able to shape the narrative. And I think this is how they're going to work here, and this is what they're trying to do. So this is not about, stopping the collapse. This is not about diverting us to something else. This is about navigating us through this transition. And we will need to be navigated through this transition because it is going to be quite rough. And for those people who aren't prepared, it's going to be very difficult. Think about what Russia went through when they were coming off their old system and bringing into a new system. A lot of people couldn't find food. There was no food or items on the shelves of stores. People couldn't get funds out of the bank. We saw this in many other countries. We're going to go through the same exact thing, and it's going to be a very bumpy ride. And for those people who are not prepared whatsoever, it's going to be very difficult for these individuals. Think about the Great Depression, when people couldn't find jobs and people couldn't get food. People didn't have money. They needed to have other people live in their homes to help make ends meet. We're going to be going through the same exact thing. And it's going to be very difficult for many, many people who aren't prepared, especially those people who haven't really been paying attention. So you need to be ready. You need to be prepared to be brought through this transition. And hopefully we all get through it in one piece if we plan correctly. Listen, everyone, thanks a lot for listening. Be well, be safe, and especially be prepared. Thanks a lot.